Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm really Ramūnas Povilanskas, a veteran, I would say, a veteran of CCB. But you can see from my screen that I also work for EUCC, national branch. It's not national branch, actually, it's Klaipeda office, more or less representing the eastern Baltic side of the eastern side of the Baltic Sea. Well, now we are like a little bit of like partisan organization, not so many participants, not so many active members, but nevertheless, we cooperate quite actively thanks to the South Baltic Interreg program, which is very generous for the southern edge of the Baltic. And we have projects over projects over projects, which help to survive not only EUCC Baltic office, but also EUCC Poland and EUCC Germany. So we three sister organizations still work quite actively in the field of coastal conservation and maritime spatial planning. They also work for more, not really full time, a little bit more than half time at Klaipeda University and the Department of Sports, Recreation and Tourism. So my presentation today will be based on my experience in the field, stemming from our joint project, and in that sense, I really wear ahead as a professor at University. So without any delay, I start sharing my screen. So what Michael said, this is exactly what I'm going to present. First, I won't talk about ICZM as such, because everybody knows more or less about it. I won't talk about the MSP as such, but what I will talk is about a little bit about system approach framework, which was the subject of our Baltic Coast project funded by the bonus program, EU bonus program, which was a program specifically addressed for the Baltic Sea, to fund the Baltic Sea research, which made it a really convenient and helpful tool to promote the Baltic Sea research cooperation. So the idea was how to connect ICZM concept with the systems approach framework as a tool, as a toolbox. That a little bit, I must confess that it was a little bit contrived, too much fuss and too little content. Finally, it turned out to be, but nevertheless, thanks to the EU bonus funding, we were able to reassess or reconsider, to get a deeper insight into many different case studies all around the Baltic. So today, this is why I'm making this introduction. Don't be afraid, my presentation won't be too long. I will briefly, very shortly, highlight what is essential about merging or blending ICZM with SAF. Then I will present two case studies. One is a collaborative case study, which is about cross-border management of the Vistula Lagoon, the Curonian Lagoon, and the catchment areas. And we could discuss about it much more because, of course, there are many Polish and Russian colleagues who won't let me lie about these issues. And a few Lithuanians I saw in the audience, so we could discuss this. And another one is quite interesting for me. It was quite challenging for me because I don't know Finnish language and not so much of a Finnish background. But I traveled, I made a study trip to Finland and studied a lot of materials as much as I could, using Google Translate from Finnish to English. So I could compare two so different countries, Lithuania and Finland, that differ in so many aspects in relation to ICZM. But finally, it both ended up in the same approaches towards MSP. So that will be my, also I will try to touch it briefly, but intensely. And then a few conclusions, maybe not so much important in this context. So, as I said, this is already partly done. My introduction. So the aim of this Baltic Coast project, I won't list all the institutions which were present in the project. I just can mention that all the Baltic Sea countries, including the Russian Federation and sorry, Russia was not eligible, excluding the Russian Federation and Finland, although other countries were participants in the Baltic Coast project, and the challenging task was to develop a coherent and systematic approach to ICZM in the Baltic Sea, and especially by using quite developed systems approach framework as a tool to resolve many challenges by ICZM, posed by ICZM. But as we worked on the project, what Michael aptly noted, that ICZM was dissolved into the more overarching concept of MSP. So I do hope that we may continue someday in some framework, maybe in the Interreg Baltic Sea regional framework, this Baltic Coast project, turning it into some kind of Baltic Sea project or some other similar. But the key, the essential point, the basic principle of the Baltic Coast project was to take available case studies from previous projects funded by the EU, mostly within the Interreg framework, and then to reassess them using a strict questionnaire developed by the Baltic Coast project, and using the criteria highlighted or elicited by SAF framework. More you can read about this in my paper in Water Journal in, I think, it was this year, beginning of this year or last year. Just scroll Google Povilanskas and you'll find it. So this was the principle that we look at the previous studies, assess their coherence, assess their level of systems approach, and then look into new studies or identify new studies where we start from scratch and develop the whole fully fledged SAF and ICZM concept. Not talking too much. This means that what issues were addressed. First, that we were demanding in the project that ICZM for us meant or means that all the parties are concerned and involved. So typically we tend to omit, like NGOs or some business sector, for the sake of simplicity, because we know how it's difficult to get a consensus from the more parties you involve, the worse situation is in achieving the consensus. But to try and involve all of them is very important. Then, of course, administrative bodies. All relevant bodies, again, they have their own interests, but nevertheless, they should be involved in a certain extent. And, of course, a combination of instruments to facilitate their coherence, because typically we see ICZM as selling environmental objectives into the whole process of port development or other issues. But of course we need to consider local communities, their interests. A typical bad example is like current government in Lithuania wants to completely abolish commercial fishing in the Lithuanian part of the Curonian Lagoon, which is a really bad decision. It raised really many objections from the coastal communities around the Curonian Lagoon. And that's one of the many scandals which may lead to really losing support for this government. This is a very new issue. I gave it to you just as an example. So briefly, what you see, this is the presentation of the ecosystem-based management. You will definitely talk about it very much these days or during the whole running of the university lectures. So but I just want to emphasize that when we talk about the marine ecosystem combined with social economic systems and the drivers, of course. This is the holy triad, which the holy trinity, which we always have to keep in mind. Although nobody takes care, actually, in many cases, it ends up just like lip service or blah, blah, as we say. For instance, in the current Lithuanian National Marine Spatial Plan, there is not a single time ecosystem approach mentioned. Although we are first to deliver, first to be proud of our plans, but this ecosystem approach is completely omitted from the Lithuanian planning system. So that's pitiful, and that's something which should be avoided, actually. And of course, when we talk about ICZM and regarding the SAF, Systems Approach Framework, we talk about the iterative process, which uses a multidisciplinary approach. And of course, again, we talk about another holy trinity of sustainable development, which is environmental, social, and economic. And on paper, it looks nice. In our concepts, on the conceptual level, it looks nice, but in reality, it always fails. I never, ever saw a single case which goes beyond the lip service, even in so advanced countries like Sweden. It's, of course, on paper it looks nice, but in reality, therefore, the ambition of the Baltic Coast was to offer as a helpful hand, as a helping hand, the systems approach framework to sort out the messy issues and do not hide them under the carpet. So how to make a really meticulous, very thorough analysis of all the issues, all the conflicting issues, and to develop an effective science and policy interface, and which embraces the challenge of simulating coastal systems and this encapsulating citizen involvement into the whole processes. So that was an ambition. I must admit it was not completely achieved, maybe on the local scale, but the bigger the scale, the more stakeholders you involve, the more difficult it is to achieve. And of course, the main ICZM driver is ecology or economy. And of course, it's again what we suggested was institutional mapping as instructed by the SAF, and it should lead, otherwise it could lead to unbalanced participation. But in our case, we as I said, we have suggested few tools which could be helpful in that sense. So what Irene mentioned me earlier, that it should be as practical as possible. So I really apologize for such a long introduction, but I think that may be as practical as possible because SAF is really good as a tool, because as a toolbox, because it really addresses those issues which are typically hidden under the carpet, as I said before. So just to illustrate, not in my limited time, but then please note, now I will talk about the case studies, leaving the whole concept of systems approach framework aside. I will not talk about systems approach framework anymore, but I will show on the example of the case studies what we can achieve in the sense of blending ICZM with maritime spatial planning. And also Water Framework Directive, by the way, which is now also forgotten in the European context, more or less. So, as you see, this map illustrates briefly what were the case studies and what were the re-evaluation studies. So those small starlets, they are showing the case, the reassessment studies, reanalysis studies, as you see on the top of this map, that SAF study sites and reanalysis study sites. So we focused on 3 Baltic Coast reanalysis studies: Rusne Island in the Neman River lower coast catchment study and Vistula Lagoon study in the Southeast Baltic, which were really, well, I know the case, I know them quite well. I could choose myself, had this luxury of choosing the sites for reanalysis, which I wished to do. So that was my choice. And then another reanalysis studies were suggested by our coordinator, Professor Gerald Czarnewski, who suggested to focus on the ICZM in Finland. And so they appeared to another 2 very interesting, but so distant and so different case studies, like ICZM on the Lithuanian mainland coast and southwest Finnish ICZM case studies. But nevertheless, that was a very interesting challenge for me to do. So I really learned a lot, and I want to convey briefly what I learned to you. So, of course, most of our audience know where is the case study area number 1. You can see Vistula Lagoon on the left or in the south of the area, or in the southwest of the area, and Curonian Lagoon in the northeast of the area. One is a little bit smaller, another is bigger, but both have the same feature, that both are shared by the Kaliningrad Oblast of Russia. And Vistula Lagoon is shared with Poland, and the Curonian Lagoon is shared with Lithuania. So that's the main feature. And also, besides that, we had another very interesting case study. Part of that case study area, I would say, is the Nemunas River Basin, which is also shared by Russia and Lithuania, which is of course, very large, the largest, of course, tributary of the Curonian Lagoon, and one of the bigger tributaries of the Baltic Sea as a result. So we have a relatively small share of the basin, the catchment area in the Kaliningrad Oblast, and bigger part of the basin on the Lithuanian side. But what is interesting, that for quite a lot of time before the recent tensions, Russian Federation was very much willing to accept the EU legislation in its own, to integrate EU principles, at least in environmental management, into its national legislative framework. So the basin management principles and the basin management approaches were very much compatible, coherent with the EU Water Framework Directive. So was very good starting point for promotion, for facilitating collaboration in water catchment area management between Lithuania and Russia. Unfortunately, things stopped at some point. And of course, the main positive findings of our study was that the management of water and living resources in both lagoon and catchment areas, because in the Vistula Lagoon we have Pregola river basin, which is also the biggest one, significant one, contributing a lot of water and pollutants into the Vistula Lagoon and also eventually to the Baltic Sea. And also the management was systematic, quite or less in institutional and planning terms. So the plans were quite coherent, and the fishery control was there, and the commissions were agreeing on fishing loads and to some extent on the pollution control and so on. And of course, on the academic level, definitely there was a lot of cooperation, and sophisticated simulation models, as you see, were applied to validate management scenarios. And in theory, everything looks fine, more or less to recent times. And if indeed optimal management solutions are available, but for instance, this Przekop in Poland to open the second inlet to the Vistula Lagoon is now underway in spite of protests from Kaliningrad Oblast and from more or less from the international community, and in spite of the results of simulation model results and so on. So politics usually deviates from policy or from good policy. And close cross-border relations exist on personal level, of course. We know each other with Mikhail, with Boris Chubarenko, with many other our dear friends and colleagues on another side of the border. We closely collaborate, cooperate, and no political tensions will stop our cooperation, I hope. So that's really good results, of course, and many projects were accomplished, and this was a really good result for these case studies. Mikhail, how many minutes I still have?
I actually think that you still have at least 5 if we will reserve some 10 minutes for questions.
Okay, thank you. So it's really good that we are in really quite well established, I would say, ecosystem of academic cooperation and research. A part of that, all of us, and really there's good funding perspectives in spite of political tensions, and I hope this continues. But the negative findings were that on practical level, it's very limited. I mean, it's only limited to environmental information sharing and joint decision taking only on fishing quotas. Regretful to see, even for instance, on the Curonian Spit, the management policy on 2 national parks starts to take the various directions. This is a long story, but really, I mean, the bilateral agreements does not cover pollution discharges, and we really, our governments blame each other on incapacity to accomplish some HELCOM targets and so on. But in reality, there is no CAR or strategic environmental assessments or environmental impact assessments done comprehensive on the comprehensive level for many projects, and especially in the periods of political and economic stress, environmental targets are the first to be abandoned, and that's very pity. So yeah, I will draw the conclusions later on. Now, very briefly, case study for the Finnish and Lithuanian perspectives. So it was for me a challenge to do that, but cutting the long story short, while Lithuania has the shortest coastline of the Baltic Sea, only just 90 kilometers, but we have to accommodate many nice things there. A UNESCO World Heritage Landscape, a large seaport, and a large seaside resort. So we need to somehow to accommodate, we need integrated planning. The advantage is short, 70% protected coastline. And of course, the problem is that there are many conflicts are there. So it's we need to find place for everything, and everyone is fighting against each other to find the extra space, actually. for each. So again, you see that this continental coastline. You see we have also to accommodate an international airport in that very short coastline. On that very short coastline, not mentioning a huge seaport. So that's our challenge. In Finland, of course, it's a very different story. The coastline stretches for thousands of kilometers, and there are two target regions of NUTS 2 level, southwest Finland and Satakunta, or western Finland, in our target areas. And of course, since such a long coastline, it implies that there are much less conflicts between port development, nature conservation, and recreation. But of course, there are other challenges like depopulation. And for instance, for southwest Finland, ICZM, they even considered the plan B. What if there comes no permanent population on their Turku archipelago? So what if only summer houses remain there? So that was one of the scenarios. Luckily, it doesn't came true. So this is the area. And again, summarizing, long coastline gives an advantage for spatial segregation and disadvantage and impossibility to have just one plan. And you see in Lithuania, the ICZM program was approved on the national level. And in Finland, it was approved on the regional level. And one level below, the implementation was delegated to the administration of the Klaipeda region. And in Finland, it was responsibility of local self-governments, and which implied very, very importantly that in Finland it was very much grassroots activity. There were very much active local public, local self-governments, NGOs involved in these ICZM programs, while in Lithuania it was very, very, very top-down exercise. It was very much top-down plan, which was from national government imposed on the regional government, then further on the municipalities. So, and I forgot, so the time limit doesn't allow me to say, maybe I will tell one word instead of conclusions, that in one sentence, that what was the outcome beyond the results of the Baltic Coast project. It's interesting that both Lithuania and Finland ended up in the same boat, so to say. In both countries, ICZM, for different reasons, as you saw, but they became very, very much integrated into the national maritime spatial planning system. Simply, at one moment, ICZM plans were, as Michael said, diluted, dissolved into the national spatial planning system, and they were made of parts of the national statutory, I must emphasize, statutory spatial planning process, which means that now national ICZM program for the coastal zone of Lithuania is part of the national spatial plan. And in Finland, both ICZM plans are part of the statutory physical plans for the regions of southwest Finland and Satakunta. So all these blah, blah, blah conclusions, I will skip them, save time. Maybe there will be a few questions.